He was 12 years old when his father made the decision. His family was too poor to survive another winter, and there were no good options remaining. There was one path that offered the possibility of palace employment and proximity to real power. That path required him to give up something that could never be restored. His father made the decision without consulting him. He had no say in it. This is what it actually meant to become a Chinese imperial eunuch. Across the entire span of imperial Chinese history, from the earliest dynasties through to the collapse of the Qing in 1912, the imperial court maintained a population of castrated male servants. They were called eunuchs, and the practice lasted longer in China than in any other civilization in recorded history. At the peak of the Ming dynasty, the imperial court employed an estimated 100,000 eunuchs simultaneously. That number represents a significant institution in its own right, with its own internal hierarchy, its own economy, and its own deeply embedded political culture. Eunuchs existed because the imperial harem, the vast household of consorts, concubines, and female servants surrounding the emperor, required male administrative staff. But those male staff could not be intact men who might pose a biological threat to the certainty of the imperial bloodline. So every man who worked in proximity to the emperor's household had to be a eunuch. This created a permanent, enormous, and institutionally guaranteed demand for castrated men. The system met that demand through a combination of poverty, coercion, and the occasional genuine ambition of men who understood what proximity to the emperor could offer. Most of the men who entered the system were not there by genuine choice. They were poor, they were young, and someone had decided that the cost of entry was acceptable given the alternative. The vast majority of them died having discovered that the calculation was wrong. They died in obscurity, in chronic discomfort, stripped of family, lineage, physical wholeness, and the possibility of descendants. This is the story of what that institution actually cost the men it consumed. Brutal reality 1, the entry cost was paid in full with no guarantee of return. The procedure that created a eunuch was not performed in medical facilities by trained physicians under controlled conditions. It was performed by unlicensed operators known colloquially as knife workers. These men ran unofficial backstreet premises with no formal medical training, no regulatory oversight, and no professional accountability of any kind. The operation was performed in a single session without anesthetic and without sterile equipment. No medical standard of any historical period would have considered the conditions remotely acceptable. Survival was not guaranteed and the outcome was not predictable. The historical survival rate for the procedure was approximately 97%. That number sounds reassuring until you apply it to scale. 3% of 100,000 men represents 3,000 deaths. From a procedure the institution considered entirely routine and acceptable. Those who survived the procedure faced weeks of agonizing recovery, during which infection was the primary and constant threat. They could not eat normally, could not move freely, and received essentially no medical support during the recovery period. Men who had survived the operation itself died during recovery from infections that adequate care could have prevented. When recovery was finally complete, each man was assessed by palace officials for suitability for imperial service. The assessment evaluated physical condition, appearance, temperament, and behavioral compliance. Many men failed this assessment after having already paid the full biological cost of entry. They were turned away without compensation and without any form of recourse available to them. They had given everything the system required and been refused admission at the final stage. Those who were accepted entered the palace hierarchy at its absolute bottom level. They had no status, no influence over their assignments, and no guarantee that their position would ever improve. Junior eunuchs were assigned the most physically demanding and socially invisible tasks within the palace complex. They cleaned, they carried, they maintained, and they waited. The men who rose through the hierarchy did so through intelligence, political skill, and the patient cultivation of relationships with people who had the power to advance them. This process took decades and required subordinating every personal instinct to the requirements of whoever was currently useful. Most eunuchs never rose. Most served for decades in minor domestic roles and died in the low-ranking quarters assigned to eunuchs of no particular consequence. They had paid the full entry cost and received almost nothing in return. Brutal reality 2. They spent their lives protecting something they could never replace. Chinese law and Confucian philosophical tradition were in agreement on one point that had direct and devastating implications for eunuchs. The body a person is born with belongs not to that person alone but to their ancestors. It must be returned to those ancestors intact at the moment of death. This was not a minor social convention. It was a foundational principle of how Chinese people understood identity, family, and continuity across generations. For eunuchs, this belief created a spiritual dimension to their situation that extended far beyond physical loss or social marginalization. The severed organs had to be preserved immediately following the procedure. They were kept by the eunuch himself in a sealed container called the bao for the entirety of his life. At death, the bao would be buried with him so that he could present himself to his ancestors as a complete man. Without the bao, he could not achieve spiritual continuity. He would face not just death, but a permanent incompleteness that followed him beyond it. This was not treated as a metaphor or a social formality. It was a genuine and deeply held belief that shaped how eunuchs made financial decisions across their entire working lives. Knife workers understood the leverage this gave them, and some exploited it directly. They retained the bao after the procedure and charged the eunuch a separate fee to retrieve his own organs. This created a second layer of financial exploitation stacked on top of the original procedure cost. Poor eunuchs who could not afford adequate retrieval or proper long-term storage lived in a state of spiritual anxiety that no amount of palace success could fully resolve. When a powerful eunuch fell from favor, which the political structure of the imperial court made inevitable for anyone who rose high enough, stripping him of his bao was sometimes added as a specific element of punishment. It meant that the man being destroyed politically would also be destroyed spiritually. He would be denied the afterlife as a complete person. The institution had engineered a method of punishment that reached beyond death itself. Brutal reality 3. The higher they rose, the further they fell. Imperial Chinese history contains a small number of eunuchs who rose to levels of power that rivaled or briefly exceeded those of the emperors they served. Zheng He, the great Ming admiral whose treasure fleets reached East Africa in the early 15th century, was a eunuch. Wei Zhongxian served as the effective political ruler of China during the final years of the Tianqi Emperor's reign in the early 17th century. At the height of his influence, he commanded armies, controlled imperial appointments across the entire bureaucracy, and ordered the execution of political opponents without consequence. Temples were constructed in his personal honor in provinces across the empire. He was, by any practical measure, one of the most powerful men in Asia. These men represent the absolute upper boundary of what the eunuch system was capable of producing. But the same institutional structure that made their rise possible made their fall not just likely, but certain. Every eunuch's power, regardless of how vast it had grown or how many decades it had taken to construct, depended entirely on the continued personal favor of one person, the emperor. The moment that emperor died or withdrew his favor, the power did not diminish gradually through a process of political negotiation. It vanished completely and immediately with no transition and no warning. Wei Zhongxian received the formal order to take his own life within hours of his patron emperor's death in 1627. The new emperor had neither use for him nor any political incentive to show restraint. Wei had spent 30 years constructing a power base of staggering scale. It was gone by the following afternoon. Every eunuch who had risen to any significant position of influence understood this dynamic clearly. They understood it because they had watched it happen to the men above them. The question was never whether their own fall would eventually come. It was only a question of when and whether anything could be preserved before it arrived. Almost nothing ever was. Brutal reality 4. The body kept the record of everything done to it. Beyond the political cycles and the spiritual anxieties, there was a physical reality that persisted from the moment of the procedure until the moment of death. No position of power, no accumulation of wealth, and no act of imperial favor could alter or soften it. Castration performed before or during puberty fundamentally disrupted the hormonal development of the male body. The physical changes that resulted were visible, permanent, and identifiable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Eunuchs who had been castrated young tended to grow taller than average, with longer limbs and a distribution of body fat that differed noticeably from that of intact men. Their voices did not break at puberty in the way that male voices typically do. Their skin aged through a different process, and their overall physical profile was distinctly recognizable. A eunuch could not move through Chinese society without being immediately identified. He could not present himself in any social context as something other than what he was. In a culture that placed enormous emphasis on physical completeness, masculine identity, the capacity to produce descendants, and the continuity of family lineage across generations, this visibility carried a weight that never diminished. It was a form of permanent public marking that existed independently of whatever formal status the eunuch had achieved within the palace system. The chronic physical consequences of the original procedure added further and sustained difficulty. Many eunuchs experienced long-term pain originating from the surgical site that persisted across their entire working lives. Urinary complications were common, required ongoing management, and had no adequate medical treatment available during the imperial period. The psychological dimension of all of this compounded every other form of difficulty. Inhabiting a body that was publicly and permanently marked as incomplete, in a society that defined masculine worth through exactly the things that body lacked, was its own sustained and inescapable form of suffering. A eunuch who commanded armies was still, in the eyes of the Confucian social order he lived within, fundamentally defined by what had been taken from him. The power and the armies could be removed in an afternoon, as Wei Zhongxian had discovered. The body remained exactly as it was, carrying the complete record of everything done to it for the rest of his life. The eunuch system in Imperial China operated continuously for over 2,000 years. It produced a small number of men who reached extraordinary heights of political influence and historical visibility. It produced a vastly larger number of men who entered it poor, served in conditions barely better than those they had tried to escape, and died without individual record. The system was not designed for the benefit of the men inside it. It was designed for the operational benefit of the institution that required their sacrifice in order to function. The institution survived for 2 millennia. The men it consumed are not individually remembered. What remains in the historical record is the story of the emperors they served, the palaces they maintained, and the political dramas some of them briefly shaped. The cost at which all of that was sustained is preserved only in aggregate. 100,000 men, 3,000 deaths from the entry procedure alone, a survival rate the institution considered entirely acceptable because the men who were dying were not the ones making the calculation.